Chapter 4. An Unscheduled Detour, Part 2. As the sun began its lazy descent towards the horizon, casting long shadows through the forest, Mrs. Penelope Brockett and her beleaguered maid Mabel found themselves no closer to civilization than they had been at dawn. The carriage, now serving as an impromptu shelter rather than a means of transportation, creaked ominously in the evening breeze. "Well," Mrs. Brockett announced with an air of unearned authority, "it appears we shall have to spend the night here. Mabel, do make sure the carriage is secure. We wouldn't want any woodland creatures mistaking it for their home now, would we?" Mabel, who had spent the better part of the day alternating between fruitless attempts to move the carriage and equally fruitless attempts to reason with her mistress, merely grunted in response. She tugged half-heartedly at one of the wheels, more for show than any practical purpose. "I don't suppose," she ventured, her voice rough from the strain, "that you've changed your mind about walking to find help?" Mrs. Brockett's scandalised gasp could have rivalled the dramatic flair of any theatre actress. "Walk? Through this untamed wilderness? Why, we'd be set upon by highwaymen or eaten by wolves before we'd gone a mile." "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Mabel replied dryly, "but I think any self-respecting highwayman would take one look at our current state and move on to more promising targets. As for wolves, well, I'm sure they have better taste." "Your attempts at humour grow more feeble by the hour, Mabel," Mrs. Brockett sniffed, settling herself into the carriage with as much dignity as she could muster. "Now, come inside before you attract every mosquito in the county." Stifling a sigh that threatened to turn into a scream of frustration, Mabel clambered into the carriage, wincing as her aching muscles protested the movement. The interior, once a bastion of faded elegance, now bore a striking resemblance to a poorly maintained barn. An uncomfortable silence settled over them, broken only by the occasional chirp of an evening bird or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Mrs. Brockett fidgeted with her bonnet, while Mabel stared blankly out the window, her mind wandering to simpler times, when her biggest concern had been which of Mrs. Brockett's prized teacups she was most likely to break during afternoon service. "Well," Mrs. Brockett said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a dull knife through tough meat, "I suppose we might as well make the best of this situation. Mabel, do regale me with the tale of how you came to be in my employ. I find I'm in need of some light entertainment." Mabel blinked, momentarily thrown by the unexpected request. "You wants to hear about my life, ma'am?" "Indeed," Mrs. Brockett replied, waving a hand imperiously. "One must make do with what diversions are available, mustn't one? And I dare say your sordid little history might prove mildly amusing." Swallowing a retort that would have certainly seen her dismissed without references, Mabel took a deep breath. "Well, ma'am, I suppose it all began when I was born." "Oh, don't be tedious, girl," Mrs. Brockett interrupted. "Surely you can't expect me to be interested in every mundane detail. Start with something interesting. Your first arrest, perhaps." Mabel's eyebrows shot up. "First arrest? Lord, ma'am, I ain't never been arrested in my life." Mrs. Brockett looked genuinely disappointed. "No? How terribly dull. Well, carry on then, I suppose." With a shake of her head, Mabel continued, "As I was saying, I was born in a little village near London. Me parents were—" "Poor, I assume," Mrs. Brockett interjected. "One can always tell, you know. There's a certain aroma that never quite washes away." Mabel gritted her teeth. "Yes, ma'am, we were poor. My father was a cobbler, and my mother took in washing to make ends meet." "How quaint," Mrs. Brockett murmured, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. And I suppose you spent your days frolicking in the mud with the other urchins? Not exactly, Mum. I was often helping my parents with their work. But when I was 8, they both fell ill with fever and— Oh, how dreadfully predictable, Mrs. Brockett sighed. Let me guess. They died tragically, leaving you lucky as an orphan. Mabel nodded stiffly. Her jaw clenched so tight she feared her teeth might crack. Lucky as an orphan? It weren't nothing like that, Mum, Mabel replied, her voice tight. The place was cruel hard, and the matron was a right beast. Ah, the orphanage, Mrs. Brockett mused, as if reminiscing about a particularly quaint holiday destination. I've always imagined them to be such jolly places, all those children running about singing cheerful songs about their misfortune, rather like a theatrical production, I should think. It was nothing like that, Ma'am, Mabel replied, her voice strained. Conditions were harsh, and the matron not known for her kindness. If anything, she was much like you. Mrs. Brockett waved a dismissive hand. Oh, pish-posh! A little hardship builds character, Mabel. Why, I once had to endure an entire season without a new gown. The horror of it all nearly sent me to my fainting couch. Mabel stared at her mistress, momentarily struck dumb by the sheer magnitude of her self-absorption. Indeed, Mum, she finally managed. How trying that must have been for you? It was positively ghastly, Mrs. Brockett agreed, entirely missing the sarcasm. But do go on. How did you progress from grubby orphan to merely incompetent maid? Taking a deep breath to quell the urge to throttle her employer, Mabel continued. When I turned 16, they sent me out to work as a scullery maid in some grand house in London. From there, I worked me way up to parlour maid and then— Yes, Mrs. Brockett interrupted impatiently. Skip ahead to the interesting part. How did you come to work for me? Surely there must have been some sort of mistake in the hiring process. I came asking for work when I heard you needed a maid, ma'am, Mabel replied, her patience wearing thinner by the second. You interviewed me yourself, if you remembers. Mrs. Brockett frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. Did I? How odd. I usually have much better judgment. I must have been distracted by some pressing matter of importance. You was that busy planning a dinner party, as I recalls, Mabel said, a hint of irony creeping into her voice. Summat about having just the right colour napkins to match the fish. Ah, yes, Mrs. Brockett exclaimed, her face lighting up. That was a triumph, if I do say so myself. The Duchess of Ditherington was positively green with envy, though that might have been the lobster. As Mrs. Brockett launched into a detailed recounting of the dinner party in question, Mabel let her mind wander. She found herself pondering the strange twists of fate that had led her to this moment, trapped in a carriage in the middle of nowhere with a woman who seemed to view empathy as a form of communicable disease. The night wore on, Mrs. Brockett's monologue about her social triumphs serving as a sort of demented lullaby. As Mabel drifted off into an uneasy sleep, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps she hadn't been a touch hasty in dismissing the idea of being eaten by wolves. At least they, unlike Mrs. Brockett, would have the decency to finish the job quickly. Dawn broke over the forest with all the subtlety of a drunkard stumbling into a china shop. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating the sorry state of affairs that was Mrs. Penelope Brockett and her long-suffering maid, Mabel. Mrs. Brockett, who had somehow managed to maintain her coiffure despite their dire circumstances, peered out of the carriage window with an expression of utmost disdain. "Mabel," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of one about to issue a royal decree, "I have decided that we shall seek assistance." Mabel, who had been contemplating the relative merits of staying lost in the forest versus returning to her life of servitude, blinked in surprise. Indeed, ma'am, and how might we be doing that? Why, we shall walk, of course, Mrs. Brockett replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Surely even your limited intellect can grasp such a simple concept. Biting back a retort that would have made a sailor blush, Mabel nodded. Of course, ma'am. Might I inquire as to what brought about this sudden change of heart? I believe yesterday you were convinced that taking a single step outside the carriage would result in our immediate demise at the hands of ravenous wolves or nefarious highwaymen. Mrs. Brockett sniffed haughtily. A lady is entitled to change her mind, Mabel. Besides, I've had quite enough of this rusticity. The sooner we return to civilization, the better. And so, with all the poise of a peacock attempting to navigate a muddy field, Mrs. Brockett exited the carriage. She surveyed their surroundings with the air of a general planning a military campaign, if said general were more concerned with the state of their bonnet than actual strategy. Now then, she declared, pointing her parasol in a random direction, we shall proceed thusly. Mabel, you will walk ahead to clear the path of any unsightly debris or peasants we might encounter. Mabel, who had been tasked with carrying their meagre provisions, consisting primarily of Mrs. Brockett's collection of hand fans and smelling salts, merely sighed and trudged forward. The forest, seemingly amused by their plight, conspired to place every conceivable obstacle in their path. As they stumbled through the underbrush, Mrs. Brockett kept up a running commentary on the various deficiencies of their surroundings. Really? She huffed, swatting at an impertinent branch. One would think that someone would have had the decency to install a proper promenade through this wretched place. How are ladies of quality expected to take their constitutional walks? I don't believe the forest was designed with that particular purpose in mind, ma'am, Mabel replied, her voice strained as she attempted to navigate a particularly treacherous patch of mud without dropping their supplies. Nonsense, Mrs. Brockett scoffed. Everything in England should be designed for the comfort and convenience of ladies of quality. It's simply good manners. Their progress, if it could be called such, was painfully slow. Mrs. Brockett insisted on stopping every few yards to rest, complain, or berate Mabel for some perceived shortcoming in her path-clearing abilities. By midday, they had covered a distance that could generously be described as slightly more than nothing. It was as the sun reached its zenith that they stumbled upon a clearing. In the centre stood a small, ramshackle cottage that looked as if it had been cobbled together from spare parts and a healthy dose of stubborn determination. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Brockett exclaimed, her nose wrinkling in disgust. "What a dreadfully shabby little hovel! Mabel, go and see if there are any persons of note residing within, though I dare say that's about as likely as finding a silk purse in a sow's ear." Mabel, too exhausted to argue, trudged towards the cottage. She had barely raised her hand to knock when the door flew open, revealing a man who looked as if he'd been dragged backwards through several forests, and had emerged victorious against none. "What do you want?" he growled, his voice reminiscent of gravel being crushed underfoot. Before Mabel could respond, Mrs. Brockett pushed her aside, brandishing her parasol like a rapier. "You there, peasant? We require immediate assistance. I demand you provide us with suitable transportation back to civilization post-haste." The man blinked, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in a frown that could have withered an oak tree at 50 paces. "And who might you be, then? The Queen of Sheba?" Mrs. Brockett drew herself up to her full height, which was still a good head shorter than the cottage's occupant. "I am Mrs. Penelope Brockett of Lesser Mudbury, and I will not be addressed in such a manner by an overgrown woodcutter." The man's scowl deepened, if such a thing were possible. "Name's Jeremiah Grump, And this here's my property. Don't recall inviting any fancy pants ladies or their skivvies to come traipsing about. Now see here, Mr. Grump, Mrs. Brockett spat, as if the very name left a bad taste in her mouth. We have endured a most trying ordeal. Our carriage was abandoned by that scoundrel of a driver, leaving us stranded in this God-forsaken wilderness. As an Englishman, it is your duty to assist ladies in distress. Jeremiah Grump scratched his beard, a gesture that sent several small creatures scurrying for safety. Distress, eh? Funny, you don't look all that distressed to me, just look like a couple of trespassers. As Mrs. Brockett launched into a tirade about the decline of manners and the general inadequacy of the lower classes, Mabel found herself caught between sympathy for their reluctant host and a perverse admiration for anyone who could stand up to her mistress's verbal onslaught. "If you please, Mr. Grump," she said, while her mistress caught her breath. "We've been lost in these 'ere woods for 2 days now. We's tired and hungry and in desperate need of help. Might we trouble you for shelter just until we can get some way back to Lesser Mudbury?" Jeremiah's gaze shifted from Mrs. Brockett, who was turning a colour that suggested an imminent explosion of propriety, to Mabel. After a long moment, during which Mabel was certain he was going to slam the door in their faces, he grunted. "Reckons you can stay the night. But," he added, fixing Mrs. Brockett with a glare, "any more yapping about fancy manners or insulting my home, and you'll find yourselves back in the forest faster than you can say, 'God save the Queen.' Understood?" Mrs. Brockett, rendered momentarily speechless by the sheer audacity of being given conditions by someone she considered barely above the status of furniture, merely nodded. As they followed Jeremiah into the cottage, Mabel couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding, trapped in a small space with Mrs. Brockett and a man who looked like he wrestled bears for fun. This promised to be an experience that would make their forest adventure seem like a pleasant afternoon tea by comparison. The cottage door creaked shut behind them, sealing their fate for what promised to be a night of unprecedented social awkwardness and barely contained hostility. Mabel found herself wondering, not for the first time, if perhaps a life of quiet desperation as a street urchin might not have been preferable to her current situation.